I'm Randy Deal, Dean of the College of Liberal Arts, one of the partners collaborating on this conference. I make opening remarks for many conferences. In liberal arts, I have to say, rarely are they as timely as this one. Not speaking about the remarks, but rather the conference itself. It seems to me that what should really be going on is there should be a big teleconferencing platform hooking you up to the group of 20 so they could share some of the insights of this group. It is an extremely critical discussion you're having. If I were not working on promotion and tenure cases right now, I would be here avidly listening to the discussion. My role is to introduce Jamie Galbraith, who will be introducing our speaker today. So, Jamie.
Thank you very much, Dean Deal. And I also would like to extend a welcome to all of the conference participants and to our students and others who are here on behalf of our dean at the LBJ School, Ambassador Robert Hutchings, who unfortunately was obliged to participate in an alumni event in Houston and could not be here. I want, on behalf of all of us, to extend our warm thanks to him for his unstinting support of this event, and again to express my thanks to all of the other participants in making this event happen. You might ask, why are we doing this here? Why in Texas, of all places? And apart from the fact that this is truly a highly functional institution, to pick up on a word that was used in a slightly different sense earlier today, with an exceptionally capable staff who are able to make these things happen in a very smooth way. It seems to me there's a deeper historical reason for holding an event like this on this occasion in this place. Texas is, after all, or was, an outpost of the old Confederacy, which was an unsuccessful model in economic terms, as well as most other respects. We are also here in a citadel of the New Deal and of the Great Society, and I have behind me the portrait of Lyndon Johnson, who began his career as an ardent Roosevelt New Dealer and ended it in his presidency as the architect of the completion of the New Deal project to a very large extent, the creation of Medicare and Medicaid and many programs of economic and social development and of economic and social integration, which not only in the human sense, the civil rights movement, but also in the geographic sense, brought about the restoration of the American South, of the American periphery, from its impoverishment following the Civil War to its position today as a fully integrated and fully normal part of the economy and society of the United States. So a terrific historical achievement on which we might do well to reflect as we think about the problems facing our friends in Europe, also 70 years following the end of their last Great War. Our speaker today is, like myself, a mild-mannered academic. He is the leader of an important and heterodox PhD program in economics at the University of Athens, and a game theorist who finds the time in the midst of the events swirling about him to produce works like this. It's entitled Modern Political Economics, which has been described by a reviewer as a work of astonishing erudition on the relationship between the great financial crisis and economic theory. And in between times, he also has emerged as perhaps the leading voice for theoretical and institutional reform in the Eurozone, while bearing witness in a very vivid way, in a way that you can follow on a day-to-day basis on his blog, to the stress and hardship that the crisis is inflicting on his country and on his countrymen. In thinking about how to organize this meeting, therefore, it was from the very beginning clear that we needed to have Yanis Varoufakis here and in a special role. And it was also apparent to me that if I could persuade him to come, then practically all of the other people I would like to have here would also agree to come. So I credit him very strongly with the success that we've had in bringing this very distinguished, very lively, very energetic, and very important group together today. With that said, I'm very happy that Yanis Varoufakis is here, very happy to welcome him to Austin, and quite convinced, again, to pick up on a remark that I think Jan Toporowski made earlier, that if there is to be a happier solution to the problems that Europe is facing, it will at least draw inspiration from the ideas and proposals that Yanis has been advancing in recent weeks and months. And with that, I simply will yield the floor to Professor Yanis Varoufakis. Thank you very much.
Mr. Dean, ladies and gentlemen, I'm humbled for the invitation, for being here. James, thank you so much for the invitation, as well as for the extremely kind words with which you introduced me. I might add at this point that there is at least one person in Texas who would challenge your choice of keynote speaker. It's a receptionist at our hotel. This morning, upon finding out that I'm a Greek economist, and after looking at the room number that I have been given, she looked up into the heavens and said, "A Greek economist in room 911? What are these people at the university doing?" Well, not only a Greek economist, but also somebody who is being asked to lift a little bit of the gloom and doom by speaking to a proposal for resolving the euro crisis. A proposal that is co-authored with Stuart Holland, who unfortunately couldn't make it here today. I'm very sad, Stuart, if you're watching, I wish you were here. Stuart is not a Greek, he's an Englishman, as English as one can be. But he's also tainted by a certain Southern European paintbrush in the sense that he lives in Portugal. So let me begin by saying that these days, whenever I speak on the European Union, I have a tendency to plagiarize Mahatma Gandhi. When he was asked what his views are on European civilization, he famously quipped, "It would be a great idea." Similarly, with the European Union, I'm tempted to reply, just to the mention of the two words, what a splendid idea it would be if we could only pull it off. Now, Bruno, this morning, used the metaphor of the Catholic Church by which to relate the ritual of our leaders getting together, like Catholic bishops and cardinals at regular intervals. I will use a different one. Whenever they get together, they remind me of Agatha Christie novels. because you know that for the first few pages of the book, or if you're watching the movie, the first few shots, when upper-class people gather in some chateau or on some riverboat, you know what's going to follow. A series of murders. When our European leaders get together, well, it's less dramatic, but a series of errors these days will follow. Actually, a comedy of errors, which will result, undoubtedly, if they continue this way, to the disintegration of the European project. Last week, I was talking to an editor, one of the editors of the influential German newspaper Die Zeit. And we were engaging in somebody I work with. I have a very good working relationship with this person. And we were trying to make sense of the incapacity of our leaders to speak the same language, not literally, but metaphorically. And he reminded me of an old joke, which I'll just change a little bit. There is this Greek ship that is approaching a German harbor. And it is beginning to sink for some reason. So the Greek captain picks up the wireless and issues a mayday call. Starts saying, we're sinking in English. And the German Coast Guard says, this is the German Coast Guard. What are you thinking of? The reason why we're not thinking, or actually we are thinking, and we're not thinking along the same lines and in the same language, to a large extent, I think can be blamed on the United States of America. And let me explain why I say this. I think you more or less agree with me. We've already heard in a conference, and by the way, I have to compliment the panels that preceded this lunch. They were the most informative, insightful speeches I've heard on the Euro crisis ever. Full stop. Close this bracket. Going back to why the United States is responsible for the fact that we Europeans cannot speak the same language. Well, the surplus countries in the European Union have a tendency to adopt a neo-mercantilist, Marshallian, as somebody said today, language by which to understand what is happening today in Europe. To put it simply, they think of Europe in exactly the same way as they would have thought of a shop that is in trouble and needs to tighten its belt or its budget in order to face a fall in demand. Whereas another block of countries tend to adopt a more pragmatic, more macroeconomic way of looking at things, which Americans should have a great deal of affinity for. But the reason why the surplus countries, in particular Germany, has grown used to think in terms of a shop owner's logic about the Eurozone has to do with the fact that it was the United States of America that, during the Bretton Woods era, created the circumstances for the German miracle to be founded on the two pillars. One pillar, a strong currency, and the other was net exports, which then continued into the second post-war period. Again, as a result of active United States surplus recycling within the global economy, which created the demand for German exports, which in turn made it possible for Germany to grow as if it faced no constraints from domestic aggregate demand. But let me not spend more time on the global situation, since the point of this talk is to talk about the proposal for what to do about Europe. But before I talk about the proposal, the modest proposal that Stuart Holland and I have co-authored, a few words on the nature of the problem, which connect quite nicely to what I've been saying up until now. The problem with the Eurozone is that it was designed effectively as a greater Germany in the context of the pre-2008 world. It was a common currency area that had no shock absorbers in case of a global shock of the kind that we experienced in 2008. Indeed, it had, as many speakers today very aptly explained, no shock absorbers, but a shock generating process or mechanism inbuilt within its foundations, the internal imbalances that we have been discussing this morning. Effectively, we had a principle of perfectly separable debts within the Eurozone, which some say is the reason why the domino effect emerged. I don't call it a domino effect, what we're experiencing in Europe, because in the domino effect, you need one domino to fall on the other, so that the second one falls on another, and this process continues. We have something more akin to what is called the popcorn effect. So once you start heating up the kernels of corn, they start popping. Even if you remove the first one to pop, the others will keep popping. So even if Greece didn't exist, the kernels of the Eurozone would, as a result of the heat generated by the global financial crisis of 2008, would start popping. And the reason for that, or one of the reasons, is this idea of a common currency area with perfectly separable sovereign debts. But not only that, an area that shares the same currency, which lacks what I call a surplus recycling mechanism, a mechanism which takes surpluses from where they're being produced and invests them in the form of productive investments in the deficit areas so as to maintain the surpluses where they're being produced. Europe never had that, and it was never designed to have that, as some of the speakers have already said. And also a fragmented banking system, which is just a catastrophe waiting to happen. Imagine if in 2008, the state of Nevada had to bail out the banks of Nevada, and the state of New York had to bail out Wall Street. I don't need to say anything more beyond that. So the question is not why did the crisis hit Europe? The question is why did the crisis not hit Europe earlier, given that we didn't have the shock absorbers and we were creating the circumstances for a crisis to happen as a result of the lack of the surplus recycling mechanism and the lack of any shock absorbers that would absorb a shock of some either endogenous or exogenous crisis. The answer is, the reason why we had 10 years in the euro, more or less, without a crisis, is Wall Street, to a large extent. Because Wall Street, as part of the second post-war phase of global capitalism, was producing oodles of what I call private money, which was flooding the world's capitalist nooks and crannies, and it was generating sufficient demand so that the Eurozone could continue to behave as if it was a greater Germany, whose demand was coming from effectively the United States of America, directly or indirectly. But when the great crisis happened in 2007, 2008, the capacity of Wall Street and the financial sector of the world to generate the demand that was necessary for the Eurozone to continue behaving as if it was not internally prone to crisis and internally incapable of absorbing shocks, as if that were not the case. So now that the crisis happened, the edifice that we had built in Europe, lacking the shock absorption capacities, lacking the foundations, and in addition, having a capacity to create its own shocks internally, which in a feedback effect of infinite potentially infinite power, destabilizes the whole edifice, the whole architecture, started to crumble. Of course, it started to crumble at the parts of the edifice of the building which were the weakest, Greece, Ireland, Portugal, but the core is coming next. I think, well, it's clear that we are already there. So this is an existentialist crisis for the euro. And once we have put all our eggs in that basket, I mean, the eggs of the ideal of European integration, the whole of the European Union idea is in peril. Now, for a year and a half now, Europe has been responding to this crisis, attempting to pretend that it is business as usual, with a few tricks on the side. Like, for instance, the idea of perfectly separable debts is to be maintained. The idea of perfectly separable banking systems is to be maintained. And all we're going to do is treat that cascade of insolvencies as liquidity problems, which will be financed through the EFSF, the European Financial Stability Fund. What is the EFSF? It is a glorified CDO. It is an attempt to borrow in the international markets by means of bonds issued by the EFSF. Each one of those bonds is made up of slices. Each slice belongs to a different member state of the Eurozone. Each of these slices comes with a different interest rate, maintaining the principle of perfectly separable debts, and a different default rate. Now, that's a CDO. I don't need to explain this further. So we created an official, state-sanctioned and organized CDO by which to fund our own nations. So you had the tragicomic situation where Portugal was borrowing just before it went under. As part of this CDO, certain slices were being, of these EFSF bonds, were being guaranteed by Portugal on behalf of Ireland. And then, of course, when Portugal falls, then the burden for both Ireland and Portugal falls on the next in line, which was Spain, Italy, whoever. And now what we're doing, now that this crisis, of course, is spiraling out of control, we're taking this CDO and we're adding to it a CDS. Because we're saying that, well, in order to go one step further and guarantee Italian debt, which is in the order of 2+ trillion euros, we can't do that with what funding the EFSF can raise on the basis of the CDO. So we're going to turn this funding that has been extracted from the money markets as a CDO into a CDS. We're going to effectively offer a CDS contract on anyone who buys Italian debt. And who is behind the very small amount of funding, real funding, that's inside that CDO now? Italy and Spain. So Italy and Spain now are being asked to guarantee loans to the EFSF or of the EFSF, which then the EFSF uses in order to lever up its funding basis by a factor of 5 or 6, in order to guarantee the new bonds issued by Italy and Spain. This is no different to Dexia, the failed bank, which was lending its own shareholders money to buy its own shares. Now, when Dexia does that, it's criminal. When the European Union does that, I shall leave it to you to find the epithet by which to describe it. So this is the business as usual story, but it's not really as usual. It's business as usual in a very unusual and mad manner. It is clear to everyone that business as usual is going to be the path that very shortly leads to the disintegration of the euro. Because once it becomes abundantly clear, not just clear that Italy cannot be serviced that way, France will lose its AAA rating, the FSF will collapse, and then Germany will have a very simple choice, either to put up as collateral more than 50% of its own GDP to save what is left of the Eurozone, or get out itself. And I have no doubt that it will get out itself. In the context of this silent realization, we have a different solution that is emerging, or proposal. It comes in the form of what I call the federal option. there are a large number of well-meaning Europeans, as well as non-Europeans, friends of the idea of Europe, who are suggesting that since business as usual is not working, we might as well go down the federal path. Well, my message to federalists is that they are their own worst enemy. Because there is no way that a path towards federation, creating the equivalent of US Treasury in Europe, an EU Treasury, is going to come into being before this process of unraveling of the Euro's disintegration is completed. In other words, whatever we do in the direction of federalism, the crisis will outpace us. And there will be nothing left to federate in the end, except for smoldering ashes of what used to be the European Union. The greatest danger from a political point of view, because this is a political crisis after all, is that the federal option comes as a result of the fact that it is a desperate attempt to find a solution, comes wrapped up in an authoritarian packaging. The idea here is, since the crisis is so quick, democracy is a luxury. Forget about it. What we need is a Leviathan, probably with a Germanic accent, telling the member states of the Eurozone what to do. And only under those circumstances will we consider some kind of merging of public debts, of sovereign debts, some kind of Eurobond, which will then be jointly and severally guaranteed by different member states. At that point, Europeans despair, because they know that firstly it won't work, and secondly, while not working, it introduces an agenda which is authoritarian and goes against the grain of the history of the democratic struggles of the peoples of Europe. So the federal option is going to fail too, politically and economically. So we come to the proposal. It's an idea that it's not rocket science. It's based, as you already heard, on the New Deal. It is effectively a New Deal for Europe. But it is a New Deal that has to be respectful of the institutional constraints that Europe has. We don't have a federal government. We don't have a federal debt. And as I said, the federal option is out for the reasons that I'm not going to repeat. So how can you have a New Deal for Europe under those circumstances? I shall be brief, because anyone who really wants to delve into it can read the proposal. 3 steps. 3 problems, 3 realms of the crisis, 3 steps. The first one has to do with the banking system. Unified. Instead of having this cozy, corrupt relationship between national governments and banks which pretend to be national banks, but they are not, they're international banks, unify them, create, perhaps use the EFSF, detoxify it by turning the EFSF into an instrument that does in Europe what the Fed does regarding bank supervision in the United States. Recapitalize them forcefully, because they are insolvent, let's face it. And only after you change the boards of directors, conduct proper stress tests, not the stress tests that we have been conducting so far, not in order to reveal the true state of affairs with our banking system, but in order to conceal it. This is what we have been doing so far. So, turn the EFSF into a banking regulator and a recapitalizing agency. That's step number 1. Step number 2, the EFSF was created in order to deal with the debt, the sovereign debt. So who looks after the sovereign debt? We heard this before. Jan said this. A number of speakers this morning suggested it. What we need is a central bank which plays an active role in the management of the Eurozone debt. Nothing less will do. Now, Germany is usually, when they hear that, they say, oh my God, he's talking about monetizing the debt. I don't have any great objection to the idea of debt monetization, but I'm not proposing it. And we're not proposing it in the modest proposal, because it is a modest proposal. We do not pretend to have the the delusion of grandeur to think that we can change the mind of Germans on printing money effectively. Tim Geithner knows full well how difficult it is to speak those words in front of Europeans. But the idea here is this. Okay, let's take it as a constraint, as an exogenous constraint, that debt monetization is not going to happen by the ECB. What can happen, which is completely consistent with Germanic sensitivities and sensibilities, is that the ECB could do something in the form of becoming the borrower come lender of last resort. To put it very simply, if you take a young couple which cannot repay its mortgage simply because it's finding it difficult to make up payments, interest rates are too high for this couple because they have low credit worthiness, and they have low credit worthiness because they have a bad history or a non-existent history with the bank. Imagine that their parents can get a loan on their behalf because at a lower interest rate and with better terms. And they help the young couple convert that loan on the condition that it is a young couple that meets the monthly repayments. This is the debt conversion. Well, the ECB can do this on behalf of the whole of the Eurozone. Instead of going to Greece and trying to deal with the problem of the insolvency of the Greek state by means of an expensive loan or a loan a bilateral loan, and then discovering that the bushfire has spread to Ireland, and then that it has spread to Portugal and so on, the ECB can take it upon its shoulders to service, let's say, Maastricht compliant debt of the whole of the Eurozone, and at the same time open debit accounts, not credit accounts, debit accounts for each member state, so that the money that the ECB borrows in international money markets through issuing bonds in its own name, guaranteed not by Germany, Holland, Greece, by anyone, is repaid in these debit accounts by the member states in the long run at the interest rates, the very low interest rates, that the ECB will be able to secure in the money markets. Now, this debt conversion means that we do not have euro bonds, which are guaranteed by member states. Therefore, we don't have a fiscal union, and we don't have debt monetization. At the same time, it means that this new deal for Europe can begin to unfold in the realm where it truly matters, in the realm of investment. Because in Europe, we have something called the European Investment Bank, which has the capacity, at the last count, of injecting investment projects, and it does have already business plans for specific investment projects that amount to about 9 to 10% at the last count of the Eurozone's GDP. That is a major New Deal kind of investment-led recovery project. And what stops the European Investment Bank from going ahead today? They want to go ahead today. What stops them? There is an article, a clause in their charter, which suggests, binds the EIB to fund only 50% of every project. The rest has to be funded by national governments, which of course are bankrupt. But if the ECB, the European Central Bank, has created those debit accounts and has created this instrument, ECB bonds, which it can sell internationally, there is nothing to stop the ECB from becoming a partner of the EIB. The EIB already funds these projects through its own Eurobonds, effectively. If the ECB can issue its the remaining 50% on behalf of Europe in order to co-finance these EIB bonds, EIB projects, I should say, then together the ECB and the EIB could create the investment-led recovery, which will be, in the final analysis, the final nail in this crisis coffin. Let me finish by saying that this proposal is modest because it requires not one change in any of the existing treaties. It utilizes existing institutions, the ECB, the European Investment Bank, as well as the FSF as a banking regulating authority. And it is a proposal whose purpose is not to solve the problems of European capitalism. It is a proposal whose modest purpose is to arrest the free fall in which Europe is finding itself in. After that, the true debate can begin about what we want to do with Europe. After that, we can start discussing possible moves towards a federalism which is not imposed upon us by the crisis, by that ugly beast, nor is it a federalism that needs necessarily to copy the United States model. We Europeans can find our own way to a federalism which is consistent with our people's aspirations, our democratic principles, and a federalism which is not imposed upon us either by financial markets or by the fear of the collapse of the euro. We shall be ready to do that when and if this kind of proposal salvages the European Union and the project of European integration, and when we're ready as Europeans to start imagining the moment when we dissolve our national armies to create one defense force for Europe, when we are capable of recovering the ancient Greek concept of isigoria, which, let me remind you, simply means that opinions should be valued on the basis of their merit and not on the basis of the accent of he or she who actually speaks the words. When we can imagine a situation where Greeks will be voting for German politicians to represent them and vice versa. And finally, when at a symbolic level, but I think an important one, we can start thinking of what to put on our euro notes instead of these silly bridges and gates, which are non-existent, and the only thing they symbolize is our collective incapacity to come up with collective symbols. Thank you. Questions?
May I ask you just one question? I agree with you that the...
Sir, microphone.
Sorry.
It's a human microphone. You say it, we repeat it.
It's for the...
No, my question is, to what extent is it possible for the European Central Bank, within the existing constitutional constraints, to issue its own bonds? And to what extent will it ever get the approval of the German Federal Constitutional Court in Karlsruhe?
Right. Let me repeat the question for people watching over the internet. Firstly, what are the constraints on the ECB to issue its own bonds? And secondly, what are the chances that it will pass through the German Constitutional Court? I think that there is no problem here. And let me tell you why. Actually, I'll tell you a story. When I was conscripted into the Greek army at the age of 40, I had a Walkman back then on me and a cellular phone, a cell phone. And they let me keep the phone and they confiscated the Walkman. The reason was that there was, cell phone technology was too, they had not thought of it. So there was no rule that said it should be confiscated, but the Walkman was confiscated. Similarly, in the case of the ECB, there's nothing in its charter or in any Lisbon Treaty or other treaty which bans the ECB from issuing its own bonds. What it bans is fiscal transfers. What it bans is the creation of credit accounts within the ECB for member states. So here we are saved by the fact that nobody had actually thought of a central bank issuing its own bonds. This is another criticism that is waged against the modest proposal. They say, well, no central bank has ever issued bonds.
Chile does, Oman does, there's several.
Right. Well, no major one. And thank you for this. I didn't even actually know that Chile does. But the point is that, you know what? There is an exceptionalism when it comes to the ECB anyway. There's never been a central bank in human history which did not have a counterparty in a Treasury Department. So since we're asking it to do something extraordinary, you might as well give it extraordinary powers. Now, regarding the Constitutional Court explicitly rules on the question, I'm not a lawyer, but This is what I've been told. It rules exclusively on the question of fiscal transfers and of whether German taxpayers are going to be held accountable for Greek debts. Well, the ECB's bonds are not being, the ones we propose, are not going to be guaranteed by the German taxpayer anyway. So it does not fall in the jurisdiction of the German Constitutional Court.
Pedro da Costa from Reuters News. Just how do you envision the first element of your proposal, which is this cross-border uniting of the banks, and how do you suggest that? I imagine that any implementation of a proposal like yours, even if it works over the medium term, is going to lead to very short-term market panics that could kind of unravel whatever goal you're trying to reach. How would you forestall that, for instance?
Well, I think we're in a country which has experienced the unification of its banking sector some time ago. And it's also a country that did so as a result of, if I'm not mistaken, the 1907 crisis. So here we have a crisis. We have a banking sector which is insolvent in Europe. And it is quite clear that no single member state has the capacity of bailing its banks out. So the second question about market panic, I don't think that we can have more market panic than we do already. You just need to say the word Société Générale to the markets and they freak out. The news that the Eurozone, the European Union, whoever, is taking steps to create Europe-wide supervision and Europe-wide institutions capable of propping up the banks should cause the markets to breathe a sigh of relief, not the opposite.
Well, first I want to congratulate you on making such a bold, modest proposal. It's really wonderful to hear that, and I think, especially for our students here, it's great for them to see scholars actually making serious, rigorous proposals for public policy change. So I praise that. I just think it's wrong-headed. But nonetheless, I praise you for doing that, and we'll have time to talk about this in the next session. The two questions I'd bring up, one, the anti-German tone to your proposal. There's no European Union without the Germans. I mean, the history of the European Union as we know it, it's a German project from the start. So in a sense, many of the problems you point out are part of the deal that was made to get this process rolling. So to some extent, trying to salvage a system that was created out of a North European set of priorities might in and of itself not be possible in the terms you're talking about. And that leads me to my concern about the New Deal model. Investment within Europe across the line from a central entity, it can work if the investment is actually going to produce productive capacity, right? The New Deal, it's debated, to the extent to which the New Deal solved the problems of the Depression. It's the New Deal and World War II.
Sure.
And I assume you're not arguing for World War III to go along with the investments. So,
it's a correct assumption.
So how are you going to assure that you get the benefits of the New Deal without the very high potential costs of misallocated money? Because as you yourself pointed out, lots of capital has been flowing into Europe over the last 10 to 20 years. It's that the capital has been misused. Wouldn't the same thing happen for the very reasons you've pointed out in your analysis of the last 20 years?
I'm very pleased to have this question, because if I gave the impression of being anti-German, I gave the wrong impression. One of my great worries is that we're not learning the lessons of history. The first thing that 1929 should have taught us is that a common currency area, the gold standard at the time, lacking a surplus recycling mechanism, is doomed to fail as a result of a major debt implosion. The second lesson is that once this happens and the political system fails to respond appropriately, then it's a Hobbesian war of all against all. And this is, unfortunately, what we are experiencing now in Europe. First, the common currency is crumbling as a result of the debt banking crisis. And secondly, the Germans are turning against the Greeks are turning against the Germans. Very soon the Germans will be turning against the Germans and the Greeks against the Greeks. So there is no sense in being anti-German or anti-Greek or anti-anything for that matter. The only sense here is to be pro-logic and rational about it. Pardon? Liechtenstein, yes. Are they part of the EU? I don't think they are. There you are. So don't worry about them. Now, regarding the question that you raised about investment, this is of course a bone of contention between those who believe that public investment and a government say and hand in fostering investment, especially at a time of crisis, whether that is a necessary condition or indeed a sufficient condition for extricating an economy from the mire of depression, recession, whatever. I have this deep-seated conviction, and we can argue this later, that it is a necessary condition, but it is not a sufficient condition. What I would not like to see is for a pile of money to be given to my government to invest in the Greek economy. I don't trust my government, to tell you the truth. And this is why Stuart and I have been talking about the European Investment Bank. It is an outfit with an unprecedented amount of success in picking winners. There is a track record. In Greece itself, if you look at public infrastructural works that were supervised, planned, and executed by the European Investment Bank, and compare them to those that were either fully funded by the private sector or private-public initiatives, you'll find that the EIB projects, firstly, were completed on time, within the budget, and there has never been, not to my knowledge, a single claim of corruption. Just cross the Rio Antirio bridge that links the Peloponnese to mainland Greece. This is an EIB project, for instance. This is why we think that the co-funding of EIB projects by the EIB and the ECB, leaving the states outside the equation, firstly, give us an opportunity to fund projects that are transnational. So, for instance, if you look at the map of Europe, you'll find that the transport network in the east of Europe, from the Balkans all the way up to Germany, is almost non-existent. This is obviously something that has to be done, and cannot be done by national governments, and it cannot be done by the private sector. A project of that nature, linking the eastern and the southern part of Europe to the main hubs of Western Europe, would create so much of an oomph in this context, and will be so beneficial to the private sector with all the multiplier effects that we're effectively talking about ending this crisis. Once private investors, both within Europe and without, see that there is a rational plan for dealing with the banking crisis on the one hand and the debt management problem of Europe on the other.
Let me go to Norman, and then I want to get to Richard Further and
Okay.
Oh, you have the...
Maciej Pisarski with the Polish Embassy. Thank you very much for this very stimulating presentation, and I couldn't agree more with you about the necessity, the need to have this grand, infrastructure projects binding really different parts of Europe and making them, as functioning structure. My question would be, though, about your proposal. What would be the impact of it to the non-Eurozone countries? And for instance, wouldn't it, make the sort of borrowing by them more difficult? And what would happen in terms of them being able to catch up with the Eurozone, in the future? Thank you very much.
The worst danger facing Poland, Estonia, not Estonia anymore because Estonia is now in the Euro. Sorry, I'm a few months behind. And the rest of Eastern Europe, let's say, and also, but not also Denmark, Sweden, non-Eurozone members of our European family. The greatest danger facing your countries is an implosion of the euro at the moment. If this process which I described during my talk, that started with Greece, moved on to Ireland, Portugal, now has infected Italy and Spain, soon will go to France, if that process is allowed to continue along that hideous path, and Germany gets out, Germany may pull Poland along, and Poland may become a member of a new common currency with Germany. Don't comment on that, but as an independent Greek economist, I can say anything and get away with it. The moment that happens, the new currency is going to outpace the Swiss franc in terms of its capacity to reach heights that will kill off German access to the Chinese markets and will create significant recessionary forces within Northern Europe, east of the Rhine. And that is a scenario that you should be very, very fearful of. At the same time, the rest of Europe is going to enter a stagflationary cycle, and the United States is going to be affected. So we're all in the same ship, and we're all sinking. The point of this proposal is to stop that from happening. In that sense, I submit to you that it is in the interest of Poland, it is in the interest of both Eurozone member countries and non-Eurozone member countries that this free fall is arrested. But let me also make another point about the infrastructural investment. The European Investment Bank has a very good track record when it comes to infrastructure, but its remit includes other areas which are extremely important to the whole of Europe, like, for instance, green technologies, urban renewal, health and education. In other words, everything.
We've got about 10, 12 minutes and about 5 people who have lined up.
I'll ask a brief question about the European Investment Bank. The president or director of the European Investment Bank is a German social democrat who has the unique quality in his party of still believing in social democracy, namely Thomas Miro, who began his career working for...
European Bank.
That's European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. It's a different bank.
I withdraw. I'm sorry. Have you? Let me modify the question then. Have you consulted anybody at the European Investment Bank about this?
Yes, and this is how we know that their shelves are replete with business plans that are waiting for implementation, and which are not being implemented because 50% of the funding has to come from bankrupt nations.
Richard Parker.
Thank you. There are several different financial systems globally in which this model and Europe are both vested. And one aspect of the American financial system that included hedge funds, complicated trading devices, and opacity beyond normal commercial banking or the stock markets or bond markets as such. What does Europe hope to achieve in terms of limiting a recurrence of a similar crisis emerging from the United States, given that the United States has not been successful in regulating its own markets? In other words, beyond your proposal, once you begin to restore growth, what protects Europe from another American-originated crisis?
Nothing. This is why this is a modest proposal. As I said, it's not going to be a medicine that can fix all the ills of European capitalism or indeed of capitalism. I have no such illusions. This is a remedy for the free fall that we find ourselves in as Europeans. Once we arrest that, then I think we can all join forces in another University of Texas conference to discuss about the ways of reining financialization and of ensuring that what happened in 2008, well, we can never ensure that it won't happen again, but at least that we understand the process that led to it, and we understand what needs to be done, both here and in Europe, and of course in Asia very soon, in order to ameliorate for the inexorable encroachments of financialization on real life. Microphone.
No, 1 point. To whom the European Central Bank could sell the bonds, I think if you accept for opportunity reasons, I could share, that the European Central Bank doesn't issue euro, banks should buy bonds of the European Central Bank. So how could banks bankrupt? I am not sure that they are all that bankrupt, could provide finance for the central bank. And it is connected to a point I appreciate a lot, the European Investment Bank. But the only reason in terms of private logic, internal rate of return, and I am not sure that they could provide the tool for a New Deal.
Let me ask Bruno and Heiner.
No, I think I know very well Stuart, so I think that Stuart has a problem. He thinks that people are good, but people are not good. You are forgetting two main actors here. One are the European banks and financial systems. And they have been working now for decades to build up a system linked to the American and not only American financial system to control the financial flow in the world in order to expropriate it when they think it's the moment to do it. They have built up this system. The Wall Street guys, they are not silly. They've been working for years about it. And they are very successful because they control the European financial system, and they control, by the way, the European central banks by the new director. So how do you think that Mario Draghi would react if now was listening to you? He would think these people don't know the real world because they control the financial. So unless you change the financial system in Europe, taking away all the big national European banks, or otherwise you cannot control these movements.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Is it on? Is it on? Yeah, no. I think it's a modest proposal. It's a good proposal. Thank you very much for your presentation, but it's not enough. If in your plan, so to say, we go on with the gap that I have described downstairs, then German firms will catch 80% of the projects that are foreseen by the European Investment Bank, and then it will not help. You have, nevertheless, to remove this huge gap in competitiveness. If you don't remove that, then you create a new unsustainable situation after the other. You may, in the short run, get over it, taper over it, the crisis, but the next crisis will come, and then you're in the same situation. You have to do it. You have to attack it, and that is the bigger fight, so to say. As I said, the fight on the labor market side, the fight against the competition of nations that we see here, and the transfer problem that we actually have. You mentioned it, surplus recycling, which is a transfer problem, but history tells us that it's very difficult. The most difficult thing to overcome is transfer problems. Thank you.
Okay, who will buy ECB bonds? Well, I'm of the view that whenever there is a debt crisis, there is a pile of debt, but there is also a pile of savings that have nowhere to go. And indeed, this is the case of our financial system globally at the moment. It's characterized by huge debts on one side and money that doesn't know what to do with itself. And what has broken down is this surplus recycling mechanism that connects one with the other and allows the system to proceed. So there is all this money looking purposefully for ways to be invested. At the moment, they buy Japanese bonds in droves. They even buy EFSF bonds, even though they know that they are toxic and they know they are problematic. Up until now, they were buying them, astonishingly, at quite low interest rates. So if the ECB were to issue bonds, they would be considered by investors, talk to PIMCO. They would consider it instantly to be an excellent buy. And they would be prepared to sink money into it at very low interest rates. So in response to the second question, you may know, Stuart, you don't know me. I don't believe people are good. Introspection tells me that we are not that good, however we want to present ourselves. The proposal is modest because we're doing an Adam Smith here. We're banking on the greed of people. We're banking on the greed of investors who will buy the ECB bonds. And we're banking even on central bankers like Draghi to realize that this proposal is giving them a way out. Because imagine being Mario Draghi today. You have to keep buying Italian and Spanish bonds in the secondary market with a Bundesbank looking at you as if you are committing serial murders. You know that you have to do that, even though you know that it is a losing battle and that Italy will fall asunder, even if you continue to do that, just like Ireland and Portugal did after the secondary bond purchases of the Irish and Portuguese bonds. You know you cannot monetize the debt. You know that something has to happen. Somehow that 3-4 trillion hole of debt has to be managed, and you don't have any tools. And suddenly the European Council, assuming, of course, that they have some kind of lobotomy or personality change, extends the remit of the ECB and says, if you want to issue bonds in your own name, do it. I think that Mario Draghi, being self-interested and smart, and with a Goldman Sachs background, which does not make him extremely shy of issuing things, will do it. Finally, you're right. It's not enough. I've been saying from the beginning, this is not going to civilize European capitalism and make it less prone to crisis in the future. But I have to say that it's perhaps slightly more immodest than you are suggesting, because, as I said before, the European Investment Bank is not only about roads and trains. It may have been up to now, but its charter specifies clearly, as I said, health, education, and green technologies, and urban renewal. If you utilize that, which is already there, you don't have to have a new treaty or whatever, and you create the sources of demand in the deficit countries that will allow and encourage surplus country, large corporations, to start considering expanding in those countries as opposed to going east and far east, then there is a chance, no guarantee, I concede that, there is a chance that the EIB is going to work a lot more in the spirit of Keynes's currency union and surplus recycling than we fear it might. Thank you.